Hello, everyone. I'm Nick O'Keefe, a corporate and M&A partner here at Foley in our Silicon Valley office and co-lead of our semiconductor industry vertical. I'm joined today by Christopher Swift, a partner in our white-collar JEDI group, that's Government Enforcement, Defense, and Investigations, and the co-chair of our international and national security team. Christopher is going to share his thoughts on some of the legal developments over the last few years in this practice area. Welcome, Christopher. Let me kick it off by asking you first to share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in white-collar defense and national security.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Nick. I appreciate it. I'm originally from New England, went to a small college in New Hampshire, came to Washington, D.C., and spent some time at the White House working on science and technology issues, and then decided to go into the national security space after leaving the White House. I've had roles at a bunch of different think tanks in Washington, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I've also served at a congressional commission and at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Why national security and how does it interface with the law? Well, for the last 3 decades, I've always thought that national security is one of the most interesting areas, and that the law is the way the United States government manages those issues. So between prior service in the government and the opportunity to assist clients in the private sector who are trying to struggle with some of these rapidly changing rules, it's been a pretty interesting career, and it's allowed me to leverage some of that policy experience in addition to the business experience from working with clients.
Thanks for that background, all terrifically relevant, as I can attest from our deals working together. So from a corporate attorney's perspective, if you go back to the late 90s and early 2000s, national security regime was really pretty much a dead letter. It wasn't much of a factor in M&A at all. It was the voluntary filing that was sort of more honored in the breach than the observance. CFIUS started to get a little bit more interesting in the early 2000s, but that was really outside tech. That was in oil and gas in particular, and ports, as people may recall. So from a practitioner's perspective in tech, things started to get a lot more interesting in 2018 with the passage of FIRRMA. Christopher, can you give some perspective on what changes that affected?
Sure. So if we're looking at CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and the U.S. government's, very, very broad authorities to review any foreign investment that involves a U.S. target company or U.S. target business, what we see with the evolution of CFIUS authorities is really the evolution of how the United States government has thought about security in the broadest sense. So during the Cold War, CFIUS was focused on aerospace and defense. After 9/11, we saw an expansion to focus on critical infrastructure as part of the move towards a greater focus on homeland security, not just aerospace and defense. And that's when you start to see oil and gas pipelines and power plants and airports and seaports and other things sort of get wrapped into the kind of analysis that CFIUS does. And then after the withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, and with the rise of great power, commercial and intelligence competition with Russia, China, Iran, and others, the focus has been much more on economic security. So we've moved from national security defined in Cold War terms to homeland security defined in global war on terrorism terms, now to economic security. And in some ways, it's almost like a European-style industrial policy model. The concern now is to use U.S. trade and investment rules in order to restrict or at least regulate how and when the United States transfers cutting-edge technologies to investors overseas. And depending on who those investors are and where those investors from, we see either very light review and very little regulation, or we see a lot of attention to the point of overreaction.
Thanks, Christopher. Can you briefly describe regulatory developments since then that have targeted Russia and China in particular?
Sure. When it comes to semiconductors, just like anything else the U.S. government is, monitoring or regulating around the world, what you see happening in the law reflects changing geopolitical conditions. So prior to 2018, there wasn't nearly as much attention on Russia and China, but there was a lot of attention on the Middle East. Following 2018 and the passage of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, also known as FIRRMA, we've seen a lot of focus on China and a lot of focus on other near-peer competitors like Russia. Fast forward to the current U.S.-China trade war. efforts by the U.S. Congress to try to decouple the U.S.-China manufacturing relationship, multiple FBI and DOJ investigations and indictments into the theft of controlled technology and proprietary trade secrets by Chinese companies and Chinese individuals targeting U.S. high-tech companies. You put all of those things together, and suddenly China and to a lesser extent Russia are the biggest risks, other than our usual bad guys like Iran and North Korea.
Since the beginning of the year, we now also have a reverse CFIUS process that's relevant for US persons doing outbound investments in countries of concern. So that's something completely new. Crystal, do you want to get some details on what that entails?
Yeah, so when the U.S. government has focused on technology transfer to China, especially in high-risk areas, they've done it in three ways. The first is export controls, which says that certain types of technology and technical data can't go to China without prior U.S. government approval. The second has been CFIUS. That's the inbound investment process. When a Chinese investor comes in and they want to invest in a U.S. high-tech company, the U.S. government would use the CFIUS process to review that. Now CFIUS has taken that and turned it around with the outbound investment rules. And those rules basically say, if you are a U.S. investor and you are investing in the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, or Macau, then we want to know, we, the U.S. government, want to know whether that investment involves artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or semiconductors. So before they were restricting or at least regulating, the movement of articles, software, technology, and technical data, then they were restricting or at least reviewing inbound investment from China. And now they are looking at outbound investment from the United States that might transfer some of this technology and know-how to China. Important to note, an outbound investment rule currently only applies to China, Hong Kong, and Macau. It does not apply to Taiwan, but there are lots of other rules, especially some of the export control rules that can make things complicated in the semiconductor space when it comes to Taiwan as well.
So you're seeing the reverse CFIUS process start to have much impact in deals so far? And is it starting to crop up frequently in transactions across your desk?
Yeah, what we're seeing mostly, Nick, is the sort of the standard rep that comes in where an investor will ask a target company to represent and warrant that they're not using any of the investment funds to engage in outbound investment to China that would trigger a review under the outbound investment rules. So at a very superficial level, we're starting to see that sort of language creep into, mergers and acquisitions documents. In terms of actual enforcement, we haven't seen much lately, at least not publicly. And that's for two reasons. The first is the outbound investment rule process requires mandatory filings by the U.S. investor in certain instances, and that process isn't public. And the second is when the U.S. government decides to use its enforcement authorities, they're usually waiting for a really, really big case where they can impose high penalties and use that case to sort of deter other people from engaging in similar behavior in the future. They call it hunting for whales. And so when we do see an enforcement action surrounding the CFIUS outbound investment rules, it's likely to involve some big players that did really dumb or bad things.
Got it. And it's fairly easy for transactional attorneys to deal with the rules currently and incorporate into the deal process. It's not a big, complex regulatory regime, as we were alluding to. Do you see that changing in the future and this developing into a bigger regime that has more prominence in the deal landscape?
Well, that depends on how things develop both with this administration and how things develop around the world. Remember, the law always follows geopolitical events, at least in this space. As I mentioned earlier, the current administration and its predecessor, to a lesser extent, started using CFIUS national security reviews to sort of implement a kind of industrial policy. When I first started practicing in the national security space, the notion that somebody would use national security rules to impact normal trade and investment activity was remarkable and, almost ridiculous. Now it happens all the time. So this administration is more inclined to pick winners and losers and to use national security authorities to do that. We see that in the trade wars. We see that with tariffs. We see that with a bunch of other rules that are being implemented outside the semiconductor sector. So it really will depend on, how the United States orients itself towards its major trading partners and strategic adversaries. And it will also depend on how much the current administration wants to use this particular tool to pursue economic objectives in addition to the national security objectives for which these tools were originally developed.
Got it. And we're seeing some fairly creative use of tools by the current administration in lots of different areas. So obviously we as transactional attorneys need to be attuned to that and, having laws applied in unconventional ways, given the transaction uncertainty that can create.
See, and the easiest way to do that, Nick, really isn't to get hung up on the latest press release from a law firm or the latest news report. We tend to recommend that clients follow the law and not the headlines, because you'd be surprised how often the headlines get it wrong. But really the place where companies that are preparing themselves to receive an investment or companies that are planning to make an investment can mitigate their deal risk and really get in control of these areas, drive the bus, so to say, rather than getting run over by it, is to really understand the technology that they have, to take the time before a transaction to look at their technology, figure out whether it falls into any of these categories that may be more sensitive, figure out whether their partners overseas might potentially be problematic from a CFIUS perspective or an outbound investment perspective, or even a standard export controls perspective. Do that internal work in advance, and the deal work suddenly becomes a lot easier. It's when you're in the middle of a deal and suddenly you have to do all of this analysis, that's when things can get disruptive and mess up deal timing and deal strategy.
So M&A is an important exit strategy for emerging growth companies in the semiconductor space. One thing I tell emerging growth clients on the sell side is that you have to get ahead of issues before they arise in a deal process. The last thing anyone wants is a busted auction process, or even worse, you sign up a deal, announce it, and then the deal gets busted because of something that crops up pre-closing. What are the types of export control and national security related issues that emerging growth companies should focus on now if they're contemplating a deal in a year or two down the road?
It's the worst. It is the absolute worst, especially when you're close to a deal and then suddenly you get those questions that say, please send us your export classification matrix. And the chief technology officer will look at the chief, executive officer, and they'll say, what is that? And, something as simple as classifying your products and technologies so you know how they're controlled under US law, that can save not just weeks and months of unnecessary time and aggravation in the middle of a deal. It can also protect a deal.
So there are particular types of processes that you would recommend be put in place. For example, if you've got a company that's, targeting a sale process in a year or two's time, are there systems and processes you think should be put in place now, well ahead of any outreach to any potential acquirers?
Yeah. So at least 6 months ahead of an M&A process, a technology company should do an export classification review. That's when you look at all of your products, all of your technology, all your source code, all your technical data, and you figure out, does Uncle Sam care enough to control it for export or foreign investment purposes? If you've done that, you've solved your CFIUS outbound and your export compliance questions. The next thing is really take a look at your business partners, right? Where are they? Who are they doing business with? Is your stuff winding up someplace it shouldn't go? If you're selling something into the United Arab Emirates and it's winding up in Iran, you're liable for that, and it will be discovered in diligence. Similarly, if you're selling into Singapore and you think you're doing a clean technology transaction to Singapore or South Korea, and that stuff is winding up in, the Chinese Ministry of Defense, that's also going to be a major problem in a diligence. And it's not just a major problem from a commercial perspective, it's also a major problem from a law enforcement perspective. And that's where my team really gets involved, defending companies that have accidentally and sometimes deliberately broken some of these rules in terms of selling to customers or supporting partners around the world.
Christopher, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts. That's terrific. It's unfortunately all we have time for. If anyone viewing this video has any additional questions they'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to Christopher directly. His contact info is on our website. That's Christopher Swift on Foley.com website. Thanks very much for joining us.